She walked the aisle, but not in her dress. Welcome to Deadly Puzzle. I am your host, Edric Vale. Tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from. Hearing from you makes this journey even more special. Let's begin. It had been raining since before dawn, the kind of steady, grey drizzle that made Paris feel as though it were wrapped in a damp wool blanket. Maigret sat at the small kitchen table, his elbows resting on the varnished wood, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm without his noticing. Madame Maigret was moving quietly about the room, wiping down the counter, folding a tea towel in neat thirds, the faint clink of crockery marking the minutes. The radio murmured something about a strike on the tramway line, but Maigret wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on the slow beads of water sliding down the window pane, catching the dim light of the morning. It was his day off, at least that had been the plan. And yet there was a weight in the air, a sort of unfinished sentence he couldn't name. At 9:30 the telephone rang, breaking the quiet. Madame Maigret glanced at him. He sighed, got up, and crossed the narrow hall to answer. "Maigret," he said, the words still warm from the coffee in his throat. It was January. His tone was cautious, as if testing whether this was something worth pulling the chief inspector from his own kitchen. A woman had been found in a boarding house on Rue de Faubourg Saint-Denis. Not dead, not exactly. Alive, sitting at the end of a bed, staring at the wall. But there was something wrong. "She's wearing a wedding dress," Janvier said, "but not hers." Maigret didn't ask what that meant. Instead, he said he'd be there in 20 minutes. He hung up, put on his overcoat, and slipped his pipe into the pocket. Madame Maigret, still folding the tea towel, only gave a little nod, the kind that said she knew better than to ask. The street outside smelled of wet stone and diesel, the gutters running with small rivers. His breath made faint clouds as he walked toward the corner where the black Citroën waited. Through the window, Janvier's face was pale in the dim light, his hat pushed back. They drove slowly, the tires hissing on the slick asphalt. Paris in the rain was a city of muffled steps and bowed heads, shop windows filmed with condensation. Maigret lit his pipe, not to smoke, but to have it in his mouth, the stem warm between his teeth. The boarding house was the sort of place he knew well. Narrow, the paint flaking, a smell of damp carpets in the hall. A woman in a faded apron stood by the door, wringing her hands, whispering to Janvier in a rush as they climbed the creaking stairs. The room was on the second floor. Maigret stepped in, his eyes adjusting to the dim light from the single window. She was there, sitting on the edge of the bed, back straight, hands folded in her lap. The dress was white but yellowed at the hem, lace fraying it, the cuffs. It hung on her awkwardly, as though made for someone taller, broader. Her hair was damp, plastered to her temples. She did not look up when he entered. Maigret said nothing. He moved to the corner, pulled a chair closer to the radiator, and sat. The room was warm, but smelled faintly of mildew and something else. Talcum powder, perhaps, or the ghost of a perfume. He watched her, the way she held her hands too still, the faint tremor in her knee. Outside, somewhere down the street, a horn sounded twice, and the sound seemed to pass right through her. Janvier cleared his throat, about to speak, but Maigret gave the smallest shake of his head. It was not the moment for questions. The woman's story would come. Not in the words she began with, but in the ones she hesitated to say. Maigret knew already that this wasn't about a wedding. Not really. It was about something else entirely. Janvier hovered near the door, as if unsure whether to retreat and fetch the forms, or to come closer and say something useful. The landlady had followed them up, but stopped in the corridor, rubbing her apron with damp fingers. The hall smelled of old potatoes and cooked cabbage, and from below there came the distant rattle of the street door each time someone ducked in from the rain. Maigret let the silence do its work. The woman's throat moved once, a small swallow. Her shoes were wrong. He had noticed as soon as he walked in, but the thought arranged itself more clearly now. Scuffed black pumps, sensible. the kind a shopgirl would wear for hours at a counter. The dress, even yellowed and fraying, had pretensions. The shoes did not. Beneath the hem, a dark patch of damp clung to the soles, not from the rain outside, but from the floor, as if her feet had been planted there a long while. He let himself breathe. The pipe stayed in his hand, unlit. The room's windowpane hummed faintly, with the weight of the drizzle. Somewhere a neighbour coughed, then coughed again. He spoke finally, not to the woman, but to the air near her shoulder. "It's warm in here. Would you like the window open a little?" She blinked, not at him, but as if a grain of dust had settled in her eye. A moment later, she shook her head once. "Very well." He stood, moved slowly, and sat again. The chair creaked. "You came in last night?" Another small shake. It might have meant no. It might have meant she didn't know. "Madame Caron," Maigret said, and this time he turned to the doorway. The landlady's face peered in, flat and colourless above her apron, hair pinned with 2 old tortoise-shell combs. "When did you first see her?" "This morning, 8:30. I bring hot water on Sundays to the end rooms because the boiler is—" She made a face. She was already there, like that. Alone. Alone. No luggage. The landlady looked at the floorboards, as if luggage might hide there. "Nothing. Only what you see." "What did you say? To her?" "I asked if she had the wrong floor." The faintest thread of indignation tightened her voice. "This is respectable." "And what did she say?" "Nothing." A pause. She smiled, like a person who is not listening to you, only to something inside her head. Maigret let that sit. He studied the bed, grey coverlet pulled straight, a dip where the woman sat. On the night table, a glass with a line of dried water marking where it had been full, and then not. Someone had set the glass down carefully to avoid the ring of wet wood. There was a small, cheap mirror hung on the wall at an angle that showed the woman only in pieces, the shoulder of lace, the slope of a cheek. On the washstand, a folded handkerchief lay like a square of snow. He leaned a little forward. "Would you tell me your name?" Her head turned, just enough for him to see the pale line where a ring might have been, and was not. It was on the right hand, not the left. The skin was a shade lighter there, as if a ring had been worn and removed more often than it had rested. She did not speak. He waited. The waiting occupied the room until even Janvier, who had been shifting from foot to foot, fell still. It happened sometimes. The silence grew so thick that words could finally push through it. "My name," she said eventually, and her voice was lower than he expected, a smoker's voice, "is whatever you like." "That's inconvenient," Maigret said mildly. She glanced at him then, properly, just for a heartbeat. There was talcum powder on her collarbone, a careless dusting as if put there with hurried fingers. The dress had been taken in clumsily at the sides. Someone had sewn 2 small tucks with quick, neat stitches. He imagined a hand with a thimble, a mouthful of pins, the sudden decision that the needle would do. He nodded at the shoes. "They look more comfortable than the rest." She didn't answer. "May I look at your cuffs?" he asked. No answer, but she lifted her hands automatically. The lace at the wrist had been mended recently. A thread trailed like a thin hair. Beneath, the skin showed a faint smear of something that was not dirt. Rouge? No, not quite. A shadow of colour too warm for her complexion, as if she had rested briefly against someone else's cheek. "You've come from nearby," he said. Not a question. "Not far. The hem isn't as wet as it would be if you'd walked long in the rain." Her gaze slid to the window and back. "Janvier," Maigret said quietly. "Ask Monsieur Lucas to send someone to the dress shops along the boulevard. Second-hand, lending, seamstresses who keep a mannequin in the window. They'll know a dress like this. Tell them we're not in a hurry, but we would like to be right." Janvier shot him a look that held both respect and curiosity, then nodded and stepped out. His steps thumped on the stairs. The landlady flattened herself against the jamb to let him pass. When they were alone again, the woman's shoulders sank a fraction, as if a bit of scaffolding had been removed. "You'll give it back," she said, almost to herself. "The dress?" She nodded. "If it's borrowed, we'll return it. If it's stolen—" At the word her mouth tightened. Not in guilt, he thought, but in the small, weary impatience of someone who knows that theft is the least interesting part of a story. Maigret stood. The pipe tapped softly against his palm. He walked once around the room, slow, almost bored, as if looking for a misplaced hat. Near the window, a thread of lace had caught on the splinter of the sill. He bent, freed it, balanced it on his finger. Old lace has a particular fatigue to it, he thought, like the voice of someone who has told the same lie too often. "I don't think it was stolen," he said. "I think it was lent, perhaps without permission." She didn't deny it. He went to the door and gestured. Madame Caron came half in, half out, hesitant. "Who used this room yesterday evening?" "No one. It was vacant since Friday. The girl from the glove factory left suddenly, her sister in Chartres." "And the key?" "In the office." "Was the office empty last night?" "I left at 9. "And before 9? She pressed her lips. "People know where it is sometimes." Maigret smiled, a thin crease at one side of his mouth. "People always know where keys are." She looked wounded, then mollified. "I keep the good rooms on a hook, and the others in a drawer. This is not a good room." "Quite." He nodded her away. She went with a little huff of starch. He closed the door again, leaving them in the damp quiet. Paris continued behind the window, greyer and greyer. The woman had lowered her eyes. The bridge of her nose was slightly reddened, not from crying, but from the chafing of something. Veil, perhaps, drawn across and then away. "Tell me where you were last night," he said, almost kindly. "Not the whole of it, only where you were at 9. "At 9, she repeated, tasting the number. "At 9, I was not yet here." He waited. "I was on Rue de Hauteville," she said finally. "Near the florist." He pictured the block. 2 cafes, one always half empty, a tobacconist with dusty postcards in the window, the florist who left buckets on pavement under a striped awning. Buckets of chrysanthemums this time of year, their smell like damp wool and earth. With whom? Aloud, the question sounded crude. He had meant it differently. With yourself, or with your shadow, with a fear, with someone's promise. She took it in the innocent way. "Alone," she said. Then, after a second, "Not alone." He waited again. The silence rustled its wings. "There was a man," she said. "He didn't come. And so you came here." "I came where there was no one to ask me questions." "That rarely works," Maigret said. There was the ghost of a smile. "Hear you. Ah. He didn't return it." He drew the chair closer, the legs scraping softly. "May I call you Madame X for now? It will make my reports easier to read." "Call me what you like," she said, but her eyes rested on the floor in a way that told him she was listening more carefully than before. "Madame X, you are not a bride. You are not even pretending to have been a bride last night. The dress is the wrong size, the wrong age, and your shoes would have been a misery at any church. You have a mark where a ring has been and not been, and there's powder on your skin that isn't yours." He kept his voice flat, patient. "No one wears a dress like that to forget. One wears it to be seen, or to be asked questions." "Which is it?" She stared at him then, the first clear, open look. Her eyes were not quite grey, not quite green. Quiet eyes that had learned to go dull when men leaned forward. "To be seen," she said, "but not by you." He nodded, absorbing it. "There was a name on the dress once," he went on. "Most of these have a seamstress's mark somewhere, a tiny loop of chain stitch, a habit. May I look?" After the barest hesitation, she lifted the edge of the bodice, turned it inward. His fingers were gentle, impersonal. Inside, near the seam, There was the faint rectangle where a label had been unpicked, a square of cleaner white, ridiculous in its pretense at newness. But higher, near the shoulder strap, a dot of red wax had gathered in the thread, as if a seal had brushed it once. He thought of a small shop with narrow drawers and a proprietor who sealed bills with a cheap stick of wax because it made them look official. He let the fabric fall. "We'll find the shop," he said. "It won't take long." She said nothing. A minute passed, then two. A bus groaned somewhere outside and moved away. He could feel her thinking, the slow, ungainly machinery of it. Not because she was stupid, but because she had borne for too long the weight of thought she could not set down anywhere. "I didn't want to come here," she said. But there was nowhere else. "I had a key. A long time ago, I lived across the hall." "Ah." His eyes went to the door opposite. The paint around its keyhole shone a little more than the rest, from years of fingers groping there in the dark. "You kept the key." She looked almost ashamed. It felt like a thing that proved I had not imagined my life. And last night, it proved something else. It proved that doors still open. He did not chase the poetry of that. "Who is the man who didn't come?" Her mouth tightened again. "If I say you will go to him, he will talk. He will make it sound as if I am foolish. Perhaps I am." "You can leave him unnamed a while," Maigret said. "We are not in a hurry." The door opened without a knock. Janvier came back, hair beaded with mist, cheeks stung pink. He didn't look at the woman. He looked at Maigret, the way one does when delivering something that might be nothing and might be the hinge of the whole day. "There's a lending place on Boulevard Magenta," he said. "Madame Raymond. She remembers the dress. Hired out to a church troupe last year, and before that to a photographer who makes postcards of brides in the park. Souvenirs for people who never had a wedding with a photographer. She says a lady from Rue des Petites Écuries took it 3 days ago. Paid cash, gave the name Hélène Marchand. But Madame Raymond says she wasn't an Hélène of any sort. She was tired in the face." Maigret nodded. The woman had not moved, but the pulse at her throat had quickened. "Did Madame Raymond describe her?" "Brown hair, not young, not old. She wore a scarf even though it wasn't cold enough. Hands with ink on them." "Thank you." He turned back to the woman, whose eyes had fallen closed, as if the word scarf had been a hand laid lightly on her head. "Is your name Hélène?" "No." "Are your hands stained with ink?" She looked at her fingers, as if she might discover the answer there. "Sometimes." "What do you do?" "Copy, type. Letters for people who need letters." "Ah," he said, not unkindly. In this city, there were rooms full of such women, their hands learning other people's business line by line, leaving pale rings where cups had stood on blotting paper. A silence again. He broke it himself this time, softly. "We'll take you to the quay later. You can rest in a room that isn't let by the night. We'll have coffee. There's no charge for talking." She opened her eyes. There was fear in them now, but also a thin relief, the kind that looks like disappointment from a distance. "I'll tell you some of it," she said. "Not because it will help you, because it will be quieter afterwards." He inclined his head. He didn't reach for a notebook. The things that mattered could be written later. For now, he watched the way the words gathered in her, how they approached the surface and retreated, like a fish under black water. "When I was 17, she began, then stopped and smiled a small, bitter smile. "Number. That is a novel. We don't have time for a novel." She looked at the dress, touched the lace as if to apologize to it. "There was a promise made, not to me, to a dead woman. The wrong person kept it." The landlady coughed in the corridor, theatrically, to remind them of her existence. The sound returned them to the second-floor room, to the window with its humming pane, to the cheap mirror that showed only the shoulder of lace and the slope of a cheek. Maigret stood, the old ache in his knees making itself known. "We'll go slowly," he said. "There's a florist on Rue de Hauteville. We'll walk by. Perhaps the buckets will remember you." She looked at him as if he'd said something foolish, then understood it for what it was. A way of saying they would not press, harder than the day could bear. She rose. The dress fell around her with a tired whisper. In the hall, the stair treads complained. The street air met them like a damp cloth, and the smell of chrysanthemums came as if summoned. Maigret set his hat better, felt the rain settle on the brim, and the city, which had been holding its breath, let it out in a thin grey sigh. He did not yet know the man who had failed to come, nor the dead woman with the promise, nor why a borrowed dress had been necessary to be seen by someone who preferred not to look. But something in the weight of the fabric and the stale powder on her skin told him that what waited would not be solved by cleverness. It would be solved by standing under the same rain long enough that people mistook him for part of the weather. "Come," he said. And it could have been to Janvier, to the woman, or to Paris itself. The pavement gleamed. The florist's awning was ahead, striped and dripping. Somewhere down the boulevard, a clock struck 10, and its sound folded neatly into the drizzle as if it had been rehearsed. The rain was no heavier than before, but it had taken on a steadier rhythm, as if the city itself had resigned to being wet for the rest of the day. Maigret walked slowly, the woman a step behind him, Janvier just to her side, their pace unhurried enough that no one on the pavement turned to look. The florist's buckets came into view first, lined up in 2 uneven rows beneath the striped awning. The flowers had drunk their fill from the drizzle, petals beaded and heavy, the water in the buckets clouded from soil and stems. Maigret slowed until they were level with the first row. Yellow chrysanthemums, then the dull orange kind that seemed to belong to funerals more than living rooms. The smell was thick and damp, the sort of scent that settled into the back of the throat. He didn't look at the woman directly, but caught the smallest shift in her step. Her shoulder had drawn inwards, almost imperceptibly, as though bracing. The florist himself emerged from inside, a narrow man with a face sharpened by years of early mornings. He wore a blue apron stiff with use and glanced at them in the way a shopkeeper does, trying to gauge whether they were here to buy or only to linger. "Good morning," Maigret said, his voice neutral, as if they were simply passing the time. The man nodded. "If you can call it that." He gestured at the sky. Maigret let his eyes drift over the flowers again. "Busy week?" The man shrugged, then adjusted one of the buckets so its handle wouldn't scrape the awning pole. "All Saints, of course. People come for the graves. You wouldn't think to see them the rest of the year." "Do you remember everyone who comes?" "Not everyone." His eyes flicked over the woman, just for a second. Something in that glance was careful, measured. "You've seen her before?" Maigret asked gently. The florist's gaze lingered on her, another moment before he answered. "Once, maybe twice. Not for flowers." Maigret waited, sensing the man would explain without needing to be pressed. She walked past, stopped at the corner like she was waiting for someone, then went on. "That's all." "When was this?" The man's fingers tapped lightly against the edge of a bucket. "3 nights ago, and last night." "Last night at what time?" "Around 9. I was closing up." "Was anyone with her?" The florist shook his head, then paused. "A man stood across the street for a while. I thought they might be together, but they never went near each other. When she left, he stayed. Then I pulled down the shutter." "Can you describe him?" "Dark coat, hat low, couldn't see much, not tall, not young, not old. The sort of man you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for someone else and saw him instead." Maigret took in the answer without changing expression. He thanked the man, glanced once more at the rows of chrysanthemums, then moved on. The woman followed, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, the dress whispering with each step. When they were far enough from the florist that his voice wouldn't carry, Maigret said, "You were waiting for him?" She didn't deny it. "He sent a note." "And didn't come." Her silence was agreement enough. They crossed Rue Lafayette, the traffic sluggish under the rain. The buildings here were older, the shopfronts narrower, their signs faded. A smell of roasting chestnuts drifted from a cart at the corner, mixing with the damp air. Maigret stopped under the small overhang of a tobacconist's to light his pipe, more for the pause than for the smoke. He studied her in the dim light of the overcast morning. The wet had softened the powder on her skin, darkened the fabric at the hem. "What did the note say?" he asked. "That he wanted to see me," she said. "That it was important." "In what way important?" She looked at him briefly, then away. He didn't say. Janvier had been quiet, but now he shifted. "And you believed him?" Her voice came without hesitation. "I had no reason not to." Maigret let the remark stand. He had found that the phrase "no reason not to" often hid an entire history, but there was no point in asking for it here, in the street. The rain had a way of making conversations shorter, and some answers needed the dry warmth of a chair and a table between them. They turned onto a smaller street, the kind that seemed more like an afterthought in the city's design, its cobblestones slick and uneven. Maigret stopped at a small café he knew, a narrow place with a fogged window and the smell of strong coffee and wet wool. Inside, the warmth was immediate, the air humming with the low murmur of a few customers, who glanced up and then back to their cups. He guided her to a table in the corner, where the window offered a view of the street, without being directly in it. Janvier ordered 3 coffees, the saucers clinking as they were set down. Maigret didn't take out a notebook. He stirred his cup slowly, then said, "Tell me about the promise." Her hands tightened around the cup. The steam rose between her and the question, curling like something reluctant to disappear. "It wasn't mine," she said. "It was his, to her." "The dead woman?" "Yes." She didn't look up. "She was ill a long time. He promised her something, an end to a quarrel, a kindness to someone. I don't know the exact words. But I knew when she died that the promise didn't die with her." "And you?" "I was only near it, like someone standing near a stove, feeling the heat, but not invited to sit by it." She sipped her coffee, then set it down carefully. "He asked me to wear the dress. I think he meant for someone else to see me in it, to remind them of her." "And that someone else?" She shook her head slowly. "I didn't see them." Janvier glanced at Maigret, but the inspector's eyes were on her, steady and unreadable. "And when he didn't come?" "I walked. I thought maybe he was late. Then I thought maybe he was watching. Then I thought I didn't care." Her voice softened. "And then I cared again." The rain beat a little harder against the window, each drop distorting the view of the street into shifting lines. Maigret leaned back, pipe in hand, letting the silence stretch. "You said you lived across from that boarding room once," he said finally. "When was that?" 5 years ago, before I worked in the typing office. Before—" She stopped. "Before him." He nodded, as if she had finished. "And you kept the key all that time?" "It was small," she said, almost defensively. "Easy to forget in a pocket." "Easy to remember too," Maigret said. She met his gaze for the first time since they'd sat down. "Yes." A man at the counter laughed suddenly at something in the paper, the sound brief and dry. Maigret watched her flinch. Not a violent reaction, just a tightening in the shoulders, the way someone might at a voice they half recognize but can't place. He paid for the coffee, rose, and reached for his coat. "We'll walk back by the florist," he said. "I'd like to see the other side of the street." Janvier frowned faintly, but said nothing. Outside, the rain had thinned to a mist, the kind that found its way into the seams of clothing. Maigret crossed slowly, stopping near a shuttered shop opposite the florist's. The view from here was different. The awning stripes ran at a sharper angle. The buckets of flowers were set in a line that looked more deliberate. He imagined a man standing here, hat low, watching the corner. The distance was just enough to catch the movement of a figure in white without being drawn into the conversation. A delivery boy passed, splashing through a shallow puddle. Maigret turned slightly, scanning the windows above the closed shop. One of them, second floor, right-hand side, was open a fraction despite the weather. The curtain inside moved faintly, not with the wind, but with the regularity of someone's breathing near the fabric. He filed it away without comment and began walking again. The woman followed without looking back at the florist's awning. The street ahead curved gently, the kind of curve that could hide 100 small stories before the next crossing. Janvier, Maigret said quietly. Find out who has the flat above the old cordonnerie, opposite the florist. Ask without knocking too hard. Some doors close more firmly when they hear the police coming. Janvier nodded and fell behind a step, already scanning the building they had passed. Maigret walked on, the woman at his side, her hands still folded, as if she were carrying something small and fragile between them that could not be seen. The city around them was damp and watchful, and he could feel, as he often did at this stage, that the story was beginning to take shape, not in the facts, but in the silences that people thought they could keep. They moved along Rue des Petites Écuries without hurry, the woman keeping to Maigret's left, as though the inspector's bulk offered her some shield from the drizzle and the city's glances. The wet had worked its way into the seams of her dress, darkening it in places. The lace at the cuffs looked more fragile now, ready to give way with one rough tug. She didn't speak, and Maigret didn't press her. He had long learned that the quiet between questions was where truths sometimes surfaced of their own accord. Behind them, Janvier had fallen into his discreet pattern of work, crossing the street at intervals, noting doorways and bell plates, stopping briefly to check the name on a postbox. The building opposite the florist, the one with the cordonnerie on the ground floor, seemed to interest him more than the rest. Maigret, without turning his head, could sense the younger man's glance upward toward that second-floor window, the one open a fraction too wide for such a day. They reached the end of the street where a tram rattled past, splashing the curbside with dirty water. Maigret steered them into a narrow passage that cut back toward the boulevard. Here, the noise of traffic dimmed, replaced by the smell of wet stone and the faint echo of footsteps that might have been their own. "You've been looking over your shoulder," Maigret said, his tone without accusation. She kept her eyes ahead. "I suppose I have. Expecting someone? I don't know what I'm expecting," she said. And for the first time her voice carried the brittleness of someone who has been awake too many nights in a row. But when you've stood on a corner waiting and someone doesn't come, you start to think perhaps they are only late. And then perhaps they are there but you cannot see them. And then you stop, knowing which you'd prefer. Maigret nodded, as though she'd said something about the weather. The man from the florist's story. What would he have done if he had come? She slowed slightly, her brow creasing. "I think, only looked at me. Only. It would have been enough," she said. Janvier rejoined them a moment later, his coat spattered dark from the wheels of a passing cart. "Second floor over the cordonnerie is let to a man named Lachaume. Keeps to himself, works nights, no one's sure where. Landlady says he pays rent in cash, leaves by the back stairs. Describe him. 40 maybe. Thin. Hat always low. Doesn't seem to know anyone here." Maigret grunted softly. The description was as vague as any man in Paris who wanted to remain unnoticed, yet it fitted the florist's figure well enough. He filed the name away, not as a fact, but as a piece of fabric that might match later. They came out again onto Boulevard Magenta. The rain, now little more than a mist. The city had that washed look Paris sometimes took on. A thin glaze of light on the streets. The smell of damp paper from the kiosks. A bus went by with its windows fogged from within. The faces of passengers blurred, as if painted in watercolour. "I want to see the lending shop," Maigret said. The woman's head turned slightly at that, but she didn't protest. They took a tram for 3 stops, then walked the rest of the way. Madame Raymond's place was a narrow slit between a haberdasher's and a shop selling cheap watches. Its display window crowded with mannequins in outdated suits and dresses, some yellowed with age, others improbably bright. A paper sign on the door read, Pour cérémonie, théâtre, photography. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of camphor and old fabric. Madame Raymond herself was a solid woman in a dark cardigan, her hair pulled tight in a bun. She looked at Maigret with a mix of caution and calculation, the way a small tradesperson did when the police entered, but no one had yet said why. Maigret let his gaze travel along the racks before speaking. You remember this dress? Her eyes flicked toward the woman in it, then back to Maigret. I do. When did it leave here? 3 days ago. And who took it? She said her name was Hélène Marchand. Paid in cash, no deposit. Madame Raymond's tone suggested this was neither common nor rare enough to be remarkable. Not young, not old. Brown hair, scarf round her neck. I thought she might be in a play. She wasn't, Maigret said evenly. The shopkeeper's gaze lingered on the woman now, perhaps weighing whether to ask why the dress was back in the company of a policeman. She was careful with it, she said after a moment. Checked the seams, asked if it had been worn recently. Had it? Only for a photograph last month. A man who does those romantic pictures in the park, brides and grooms in borrowed finery. She gave a small, indulgent shrug. People like to see themselves in a story. Maigret nodded, thinking of the mark where the label had been unpicked, of the dot of wax by the seam. And before that? Madame Raymond hesitated, rummaging in the memory of her business. A church group borrowed it last year, for a pageant. Before that, oh, there was a wedding, but that was years ago. It's a dress with more history than cloth, you could say. He let that hang in the air for a moment, then asked, Did she mention why she wanted it? Number. And I didn't ask. People have their reasons. Some want to be seen, some not to be. The woman in the dress had been silent until now, but she turned to the shopkeeper. Did I look as if I wanted to be seen? Madame Raymond studied her for a long second. You looked, she said finally, as if you wanted to be remembered. They left without further questions. Outside, the light had shifted, the grey brightening a little, though the air stayed cool and damp. Maigret lit his pipe as they walked, not speaking until they had turned the corner. La Chaume, he said to Janvier. See if his name appears in any old files. Not just here. Ask at the Gare du Nord station as well. Men who work nights often leave traces there. Janvier nodded and peeled away toward the nearest telephone box. Maigret and the woman walked on. She seemed smaller now in the daylight, the defiance in her shoulders replaced by something closer to weariness. The street was busy enough that they could blend into it, their pace matching the slow Sunday rhythm. Why did you agree to wear it? Maigret asked finally. She didn't answer at once. Because I thought it might end something, she said, or begin something else. I wasn't sure which I wanted more. And now, she gave a faint, tired smile. Now I'm only sure that I've been standing in the rain too long. They reached a crossing. Maigret stopped, watching the tram lines glisten under the thin wash of light. Somewhere a bell rang, sharp, impatient, and was swallowed quickly by the city's constant hum. He thought of the man on the opposite pavement, the open window above the cordonnerie, the borrowed dress with its worn seams. None of it yet formed a complete picture, but the edges were beginning to show. Come, he said at last. We'll go back to the quay. There's more coffee there and less rain. And perhaps, he added, you can tell me how a dead woman's promise brings a man to watch from a window without ever stepping into the street. She looked at him sideways, a question in her eyes that she didn't voice. They crossed together, the sound of their steps merging with the hiss of tires on wet asphalt, moving toward the river where the mist hung low and the lamps along the embankment glowed faintly in the grey. The rain had eased to a faint mist that clung to coats and hair without, quite justifying an umbrella. They crossed Pont Notre Dame with the Seine below, grey-green and sluggish, the ripples darkening as a barge passed under. The lamps along the embankment glowed dimly in the daylight, their light seeming to come from another time of day altogether. The woman kept pace without speaking, her hands buried in the folds of the dress, as though holding it close for warmth. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the warmth of the corridor felt almost foreign after the damp streets. The air smelled faintly of tobacco and damp wool, the familiar scent of the building's winter months. Maigret guided her into one of the smaller interview rooms, the kind used for witnesses who might need quiet rather than pressure. The walls were pale and plain, the only sound the occasional creak of pipes in the corner. He brought in 2 cups of coffee himself, setting one before her. She didn't drink at first, only wrapped her fingers around it as if testing its heat. Janvier arrived a few minutes later, hat in hand, his expression one of restrained curiosity. "Nothing at Gare du Nord," he said. "But Lachaume's name comes up in an old report from Montreuil, 8 years back. A dispute over a debt, nothing criminal, but he was a witness in a case that went nowhere. The complainant was a woman named Thérèse Duval. She died the year after." The woman's eyes flicked up at that. So quickly Maigret might have missed it had he not been watching her closely. "You knew her," he said, without inflection. Her lips parted slightly, then closed. "Everyone knew her," she said at last, but the words had that brittle sound of something used to deflect rather than explain. Maigret took a slow draw from his pipe, unlit but held as if it were. "She is the dead woman with the promise." The woman's gaze dropped to her coffee. A faint steam still rose from it, curling into the still air. "Yes," she said finally. "She was kind to me. When I was new in Paris, she found me work. She had a way of making you feel as if you owed her nothing, even when you did." "And the man who didn't come?" Her shoulders moved, a slow, reluctant shrug. "Lachaume. They were friends, closer than that maybe. When she was ill, she made him promise something. I was never told exactly what. But after she died, I thought it was to look after me." She gave a small, humorless smile. "It seems I was wrong." Janvier leaned against the wall, arms folded. "So you agreed to meet him, wearing the dress, because he asked. He sent the note through someone else, unsigned, but I knew it was him. He wrote that there was something we needed to finish." "And what was that?" Maigret asked. She shook her head. "I thought it might be an explanation, or an apology. I didn't think it would be nothing." The room settled into quiet again. Outside the door, someone's typewriter keys tapped in slow bursts, like raindrops on metal. Maigret leaned back in his chair. "When you waited at the florist's, and he stayed on the other side of the street, was that the first time you'd seen him since she died?" "Number once, maybe twice, in the years after, but never to speak. Always at a distance. He's the kind of man who doesn't like to be caught in the middle of anything. I suppose the window suits him. And the dress?" "I think it was hers," she said quietly. "Or it looked enough like hers that he would think of her. She was married in white lace. I saw the photograph once. I thought perhaps—" She trailed off, letting the rest evaporate between them. Maigret studied her a moment longer, then rose. "You'll wait here," he said. "Janvier, find out where Lachaume works nights. If the landlady doesn't know, someone at the cordonnerie will. And get a list of anyone who's used Madame Raymond's shop for photography in the last month. There's something in that connection he didn't want to put in a letter." When Janvier left, Maigret lingered by the window, looking down into the courtyard where the rain had left small pools in the uneven stones. A pigeon hopped between them, pecking at something invisible. He could feel the shape of the story now, but it was still hollow in the middle, as if the main act had been removed and replaced with echoes. He turned back to her. "If he had come to meet you, what would you have said to him?" She thought for a long moment, I might have asked why, but I think he would only have told me something polite, something that made it seem as if none of it had mattered. That's worse than no answer at all. Her voice was steady, but Maigret could hear the undercurrent of an old injury, worn smooth, but not erased. Then perhaps, he said, we'll have to ask him in a way that doesn't let him answer politely. By the time Janvier returned, the rain had stopped entirely, leaving the air outside damp but strangely bright. He came in with the faint flush of someone who'd had to extract information from reluctant lips. Lachaume works at a print shop off Rue Réaumur, nights mostly. Cash pay. The foreman says he keeps to himself, doesn't talk except about the work. Lives exactly as the landlady said. Quiet. Pays on time. But here's the thing. 3 weeks ago, he took 2 nights off in a row. First time in years. No explanation. 3 weeks, Maigret repeated. That's about when Madame Raymond's photographer last rented the dress. Janvier nodded. The photographer's name is Gérard Villon, has a studio near Parc Monceau. The foreman at the print shop says Lachaume knows him. Seen them talking outside once or twice. Maigret tamped the bowl of his pipe with a thumb. So Lachaume takes time off, spends it with a man who borrows wedding dresses for stage photographs, and 3 weeks later sends a note to a woman connected to a dead friend, asking her to wear one. And then he doesn't appear. The woman sat very still, her fingers tightening around the empty cup. You think it was a trick? She said. I think, Maigret said slowly, that it was a test. For whom and for what, we'll find out when we speak to him. But a man who stays at a window, instead of crossing the street, is either afraid or ashamed. Sometimes both. He stood, his coat settling heavily on his shoulders. We'll go to Rue Réaumur tonight. I want to see what kind of man works all night in the smell of ink, then hides behind an open curtain to watch the street. She rose without a word, and for a moment he thought she meant to follow, but she stopped at the door, looking at him in that way people sometimes did when they knew the inspector was about to meet the person they'd been circling for years. Don't tell him I waited, she said. Not like that. He gave a brief nod, as if to say he understood that there were truths best left unspoken, even to the person they concerned most. Then he left the room, the sound of his steps absorbed into the building's hush, the river outside carrying the pale light of the late afternoon toward the western sky. By the time they reached Rue Réaumur, the day had thinned to that bluish hour when lights decide whether to bother coming on. The street had its own smell, ink and hot metal and damp paper, made heavier by the moisture that clung to the awnings. Through a half-open door, the print shop breathed like a large animal, presses thudding in a measured rhythm, belts whispering, a foreman's voice cut short by the next roll of the drum. Maigret stood just inside the doorway and let his eyes get used to the inside light. The foreman, a square man with a neck like a bollard, glanced over, unsure whether to be irritated or respectful. He settled on something between. We're looking for Lachaume, Maigret said. The pipe stayed unlit in his fingers. The smell of the place would have smothered any tobacco. No hurry. The foreman jerked his chin toward the back. Second machine. He doesn't talk. Good, Maigret said. Neither do we. They walked along the narrow aisle. The machines thumped and sighed. Sheets went in white and came out carrying other people's words. Men with ink-dark hands moved the stacks with the economy that comes from long repetition. Lachaume was where the foreman said, a thin man, hat hung on a nail, sleeves rolled to the elbow. His face was one of those that had been pared down by habit and caution. Nothing unnecessary left. The ink had worked its way into the lines at the base of his fingers. A smear rode the knuckle of his right hand like an old bruise. He looked up when the shadow of Maigret's bulk fell across the tray. His eyes did that quick thing some men's do, measuring exits before greetings. Evening, Maigret said. Evening. The word came flat, neither curious nor alarmed. The foreman reappeared, anxious now. Do you need him? For a minute, outside, Maigret said. Let the machine miss him. There was a small pause in the room's rhythm as a man down the line cleared a jam. The presses coughed and then regained their breath. Lachaume wiped his hands on a rag that had already given up on being clean and followed them to the doorway. The street beyond was wet again, the kind of fine rain that you discover only once you are already in it. They stood under the scant protection of the awning. Janvier found a patch of wall and leaned there, looking at nothing in particular. "You work nights," Maigret said, as if it were a compliment. "It suits me." "You took 2 off 3 weeks ago." A small blink. "I was ill." "Of what?" "Nothing that lasted." Maigret nodded, absorbing the indifference. "You know a photographer named Villon?" "I've seen him." "In Parc Monceau?" Another blink, not quite a flinch. "He works there. He borrows wedding dresses for his pictures." Lachaume's mouth twitched, not into a smile. "I suppose someone does." They let a small delivery van grumble past, its tires turning the gutter into a shallow stream. The light from the shop lay on the wet stones like a second, flatter doorway. "You were at a window on Rue des Petites Écuries last night," Maigret said, no emphasis. "Second floor. Curtain moved when you breathed." A slow breath went in and out of the man, as if he had been carrying something on his back and had just set it down. He didn't ask how Maigret would know. Men who have watched know that watching is always visible from the right spot. "I didn't go down," he said. "I noticed." He turned his head enough to look at the street rather than the inspector. "It wasn't my place." "To come when you've sent a note." "I sent no note. Notes don't walk by themselves." "They do," he said, and there was tiredness in it, not insolence. "In this city, notes always find legs." Maigret studied the ink on his hands. It had worked itself under the edge of a nail. He thought of the woman at the quay with the empty coffee cup held like a small stove, of the dress that hung on her wrong, of the careful unpicking of a label. "Thérèse Duval," he said, and watched the name land. The movement in Lachaume was almost nothing, a tightening near the jaw, the way his throat worked once. "She is dead," he said, as if correcting a misunderstanding. "She is," Maigret agreed. "You promised her something." The man's gaze slid back from the street and found a point somewhere near Maigret's shoulder. "We promise all sorts of things to the dying, and sometimes to the living." A humorless line came and went where his mouth might have smiled if it had remembered how. "They are easier to break with the living." The presses thudded behind them, regular as a heart in a chest that has not yet decided to betray its owner. A boy ran past with a bundle of proofs under his arm, splashing his ankles and not caring. "What was the promise?" Maigret asked. "To make sure a quarrel ended," he said, the words careful, the sort that have been put in order many times before and kept ready. It seemed important to her, less important to others. And the others. He looked at the rain, which had no opinion. The kind who think the dead are a convenience. They can be made to say what you need. "You mean a husband." The eyes ticked once, an involuntary acknowledgement. The promise was to him as much as to her. At least that's what he made of it afterwards. He said I would stop being near anything he considered his. "And the woman who wore the dress?" This time the pause was longer. "She is near nothing. That is the problem. People have made her into the space around their words. She has had to learn to be quiet so as not to be stepped on." "Yet you sent for her," Maigret said lazily. He let the lie hang. It sagged in the middle. "I asked someone to tell her I would be at the corner," he conceded. "I didn't ask for the dress." "Who did?" He rubbed his thumb against the rag, as if there were a speck there that would not come. "Vaillant has his ideas. He says memory needs props. You took time off to be with him. I took time off to see if a picture would change a man's mind." A dry sound came from his throat, not a laugh. It didn't. Maigret pictured the park, the staged white, the rehearsed happiness. A borrowed dress on a woman who had never had the photograph. A photographer who sold manufactured nostalgia. A man watching from a window. Why the window? He asked softly. You tell yourself it was not your place. That's the reason men give when it is exactly their place, and they are afraid of how small they will look in it. At that, Lachaume turned his head fully. There was something of shame in his eyes, but more of tiredness. I have learned, he said, that when you stand between a promise and a quarrel, both sides use you to keep their hands clean. The dead forgive you. The living don't. A tram bell clanged somewhere down the street. It sounded oddly cheerful. What did you hope for last night? Maigret asked. That he would come, the man said, and only after said, or that she would go. And if he had come, I would have told him he was a coward, he said without heat. He would have agreed in the way men do when agreeing costs nothing. They let the rain patter on the awning. Janvier shifted, pushing off the wall. Where does the husband live? He asked. Lachaume looked at him, as if remembering there were more than two people under the awning. Husband, he repeated, and corrected it with precise weariness. Widower, Rue Richer, 4th floor. He plays cards at the cafe on the corner and wins when he shouldn't. Name? Duval, same. It is a name that has not tired of being written. Did he see the photograph? Maigret asked. Not yet, Lachaume said. He will. He is the kind of man who arranges to arrive last so that everyone must watch him enter. Where is the photograph now? With Villon. He was to deliver it when it pleased him to be paid. Of whom? The man looked past Maigret again, somewhere toward the patience of the machines. Of the living woman, dressed as the dead one. But you knew that. Maigret nodded. He hadn't known it, but he had been walking in circles around the shape of it. And why should Duval see it? To remember his promise, Lachaume said, the first trace of heat in his voice. To be kind, to spare her from being the space around his words, to settle something, if not with me, then with himself. The door opened behind them, and the foreman's head appeared like a reluctant moon. If he's not dead, I'd like him back, he said. The machine prefers more than ghosts to tend it. We're finished, Maigret said. He waited until the foreman had gone, then looked at Lachaume a last time. You watched, and you didn't come down. If there is a coward in this, you are not the only one. I know, the man said, not defending, not agreeing, only acknowledging the obvious, in the tone of someone who has grown used to living with it. He went back inside, hat still hanging on its nail, sleeves still rolled. The machine accepted him again, as if he had never left. They walked away. The rain had found a finer grain. It felt like breath on the face. Janvier put his hands deep in his pockets and lengthened his stride to match Maigret's. Do we pick up Duval? He asked. Not yet. Villon then? After, Maigret said. There's a window I'd like to look through while no one expects me. They took a detour that was not a detour, feet finding the remembered route to Rue des Petites Écuries. Lights had come up in ragged squares along the facades. The open window above the cordonnerie was shut now, the curtains slack and honest. In the street below the florist's awning lay flat and dark, the buckets pulled inside like animals gone to shelter. Maigret stood where a man had stood and tried the distance with his eyes. He thought of a promise spoken in a sick room, where the air smells of hot water and old flowers, of a widower who wins when he shouldn't, of a photographer who sells arranged memories to people who have none of their own, of a woman who had put on the wrong dress for the right reason and been left between a quarrel and a promise as if between two panes of glass. He imagined the photograph as it would be delivered, perhaps in a stiff envelope with the studio's stamp in corner letters, perhaps with a small smear of red wax on the flap to make it feel distinguished. The woman would be there in the picture, made to look like someone else. The widower would see it and decide whether to be kind, and whatever he decided would be less about the woman than about the story he wanted to live in. That window, Janvier said, nodding up. You think he's there now? No, Maigret said. He is where men go when they have done the little they could do, and are waiting to be found out for how little it was. The café, Janvier guessed. Or the print shop, Maigret said. It's the same thing in the end. They turned away at last. The night had settled in, not dramatically, just by degrees, the way it always did. The city went on with its modest conspiracies, the typewriters ticking, the trains sliding in, the cards slapping down on worn tabletops. On Rue Réaumur, the presses would keep striking the same beat, printing other people's promises in columns and selling them by the page. We'll see Villon in the morning, Maigret said. He will have the photograph ready with his little speech about art and memory. He will tell us we misunderstand. We won't argue. We will let him talk himself into the truth. And Duval? We will give him the courtesy of a late entrance, Maigret said. He likes that. They crossed toward the river without speaking again. Somewhere behind them, a woman laughed in a doorway, too loud, then softer, as if remembering the hour. In the quay's courtyard, the pools of water had given up trying to look like mirrors. The building took them back, doors closing with the tired sound of hinges that had heard most human explanations and been convinced by few. In his office, Maigret stood by the window a minute more, looking at the lamps freckling the river and thinking, not of what he knew, but of the few things that still needed to be said aloud to make the day honest. He lit his pipe at last, the smoke spreading with the same patience as the rain had, and only then did he allow himself the small admission that what smelled wrong since morning had a name now, and the name had nothing to do with murder. It was the simpler stink of pride, and a promise made too late. Morning brought a thin sun that didn't quite manage to warm anything, only made the damp look honest. Maigret woke early without trying to, the habit of years tugging him from sleep at the same hour whether there was need or not. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and of the night's rain that had crept in at the window frame. Madame Maigret set a plate before him and fussed with the radio dial until a voice from somewhere in the provinces admitted it would be colder tomorrow. He ate in the unhurried way of a man who lets the day come to him. The dress had remained with him through the night, not as lace and cloth, but as a thought, a wrong size worn for a right reason, the hem that had learned too many pavements, the powder not her own. He was turning over the dot of red he'd seen caught in the inner seam, wax most likely, when Madame Maigret, wiping her hands, said almost idly, "Photographers like to seal things. Bills, envelopes. Makes people feel they've bought more than paper." He looked at her. It was the sort of remark one forgets one heard anywhere, because it seems one always knew it. "You're thinking of someone's wedding?" he asked. "I'm thinking of the women who bring their wedding pictures to be copied," she said. "They want to believe the second print has the same years in it. The men who do the work put a bit of wax on the envelope and the ladies go away soothed." She gave a small shrug, as if to apologize to the entire profession. "It's kind in a way." He took his coat from the peg. "Kindness with a profit," he said without malice. "I'll be home for lunch if Paris allows it." Paris rarely did, but it pleased her to hear it. By 10, he and Janvier were on Boulevard de Courcelles, where the buildings kept their chins a little higher, and the glass in the shop windows had more faith in itself. Villon's studio sat above a tailor's, 3 steps too many in the staircase, the kind that make one breathe a fraction harder than one admits. A bell on the studio door rang a note that might once have been cheerful. Inside, there was a smell of paper and warmed dust, a sweetness from a bowl of stale biscuits left out for clients who didn't eat them. Light fell from a high window that had been coaxed into generosity with white muslin. On one wall, framed under glass, a procession of impossible people gazed out. A bride with a too perfect veil, a groom whose shoes shone like a lie, children who held still only because they had been bribed. A corner held props, a bouquet of waxy flowers, a hat box, a strip of lace yellowed to a graceful honesty. On the desk, A stick of red sealing wax lay beside an inkstand, as if they had been arguing about who conferred more importance. Villon emerged from a small darkroom wiping his hands on a towel. He was younger than Maigret had expected, or perhaps he only wore youth on his face because it was good for business. He smiled the way tradesmen do when they have decided a visitor will not pay them but might cause trouble if not humoured. "Inspectors," he said lightly. "What can art do for you this morning?" "Art can show us an envelope," Maigret said, and let his eyes travel to the wax. "And perhaps a photograph that likes to be sealed." Villon's smile tightened at one corner. "Ah, that one." He set the towel down with care. "Which gentleman has been speaking? The one who pays on time, or the one who watches from across streets?" "We've spoken with the one who works nights," Maigret said. "We'll speak with the other when he's finished arriving late." Villon laughed without sound, pleased despite himself. He crossed to a drawer and brought out a stiff envelope with his studio's name embossed in the corner. The flap had a neat red seal pressed with some little emblem that pretended to be heraldry. He didn't hand it over at once. Instead, he laid it on the desk, his palm resting lightly on it as if it might try to escape. "It is not yet delivered," he said, "nor paid for fully. I'm sentimental about some things and businesslike about others." Maigret did not reach for it. "Who ordered it?" "A Monsieur Duval." Villon's gaze slid, weighing whether the name meant anything in the room, then saw that it did. "He brought me an old wedding portrait. 20 years, perhaps. He wanted, how did he put it? A reminder." "Of whom?" "Of himself, I think," Villon said. And for a moment there was something almost decent in his voice. "Of what he liked to be. But he said it was for a friend. He brought the friend the first time, the man with ink on his hands. The woman came the next day." "She agreed easily?" "Easily." Villon lifted a shoulder. "Number." "She agreed the way people do when they hope agreeing will end something. She wanted to be done with it before she began." "You chose the dress," Maigret said. "I suggested one. She went to a lending shop and brought this." He nodded at the lace at the edge of the envelope, as if the garment lay there within. It was slightly wrong. That's what made it nearly right. Memory prefers approximations. Exactness shows the trick. Maigret took out his pipe, turned it in his fingers. "You sealed the envelope yourself." "It keeps the feeling in." Villon smiled again, a salesman's romance. "Also, it keeps clients from saying they never opened it." "Was the widower satisfied?" "He likes to collect before he decides," Villon said. "He wanted the bouquet arranged a certain way. He wanted the veil pinned lower, here." He touched his own collarbone, and in Maigret's mind the powder on the woman's skin rose like breath on a cold day. He wanted the light to come from the left, because that's how it was in the old picture. He didn't say so, but I think he wanted to see if he could be moved in exactly the same place. Could he? "I'm a photographer, Inspector, not a magician." Villon's face softened with the faintest pity, though for whom it was difficult to say. "I can only give people back the shape of what they want. Whether it fits them is their own business." Janvier, who had been tracing the frames on the wall with his eyes, said, "Why involve the woman at all? Why not make a copy of the old portrait and be done?" "Copies don't argue," Villon said. "They also don't satisfy pride. Men like proofs that look like choices." He slid the envelope with a finger until it came to rest near Maigret's hand, but he still didn't let go of it. The seal caught the light. For a second, the red shone exactly like the dot Maigret had seen in the seam of the dress, hardened there by a brush of carelessness. "When will Duval come?" Maigret asked. "This afternoon. He likes to arrive when the light is nice on the frames. He believes it makes his taste look better." "You'll give him the photograph?" "I'll give him the envelope," Villon said neatly. "What the photograph does after that isn't my responsibility." Maigret nodded, as if that settled all questions of morality. He did not ask to open it. There was no hurry to see what he already knew it would show. A woman who looked like someone else, dying a second time for the benefit of a man who preferred to play cards with grief rather than speak to it. "Keep it," he said, standing. "We'll relieve you of the responsibility later." Villon inclined his head, relieved and disappointed at once. "As you wish. If you'd like a biscuit for your trouble, they're very good when fresh." "They must have a busy life waiting for that," Maigret said, and the photographer, who had been prepared to be offended, found himself laughing instead. They left the studio and went down into a noon that hadn't decided whether to brighten. On the pavement, a woman shook crumbs from a tablecloth into the gutter. A dog considered them and decided against it. Janvier walked a few paces in silence, then said, "Do we take the envelope now and save the speech?" "No," Maigret said. "Let him make his entrance. Some men need the stage to show the kind of truth they're capable of." They ate quickly in a bistro where the mirrors were clouded and the stew came whether one asked for it or not. Maigret had a small glass of beer and let it sit mostly untouched. He found himself thinking of the promise in a sick room, of the sort of kindness that asks to be admired while it is being done. Through the window he could see a boy tying a parcel with string, his tongue between his teeth in concentration. When he finished, he pressed the knot with a finger as if to bless it. By mid-afternoon they were on Rue Richer, where the café on the corner had its bamboo blinds half lowered against a light that wasn't threatening anyone. The place smelled of anise and cigarettes and the thin, metallic smell of coins. There were 4 men at the card table, 3 with the look of men who had decided to be unlucky for the sake of the afternoon, and 1 with a neat moustache who liked to collect the tricks with a small, practiced surprise. Duval arrived later than there was any point to arriving. He stood for a moment in the doorway, not to let his eyes adjust, but to let other people's attention do it for him. His suit had been brushed in the stubborn way people brush clothes instead of changing them. His shoes were scuffed at the inside edge where pride trips first. He greeted the room without committing to a name, let the waiter bring him without asking an aperitif he had asked for every day for years, and drifted to the table with the exact casualness of a man who wants to be begged to sit. He was not begged. He sat anyway. From his place near the window, Maigret watched him play. The cards came and went, and Duval won when he shouldn't, not by skill, but because he understood the rhythm of concession. He let himself lose early and cheaply so the others would allow the afternoon to be easy, and then he gathered what he could from the comfort he had purchased. It was a way of living, too, Maigret thought. When Duval glanced up finally and saw the inspector, his face did nothing. Only his hand placed a card a fraction too carefully, as if a mirror had been set on the table. The game ran a few hands more and dissolved without a word. Chairs scraped, coins clinked. Time resumed. "Inspector," Duval said, arriving at the bar beside him, as if by coincidence. His voice had the varnish people put on to cover grain that has gone rough. "A drink?" "Later," Maigret said. "You have an errand first." Duval's eyebrows suggested that errands were for other people. "Do I?" "At Parc Monceau," Maigret said. "Upstairs from a tailor. There's an envelope there with a little red seal that is very proud of itself." Something moved under Duval's left eye, so small that if Maigret had not been waiting for it, he would have thought he imagined it. He lit his pipe and let the gesture finish before speaking again. "You wanted a reminder delivered to you. It is ready. We'll go together. It will be less theatrical than meeting there separately and pretending surprise." Duval considered the pipe as if it had addressed him. He had the air of a man who weighs not the sense of an invitation, but the posture it will let him keep. At last he said with false carelessness, "As you like." They walked out into a city that had decided to brighten after all, not because it had a reason, but because Paris sometimes changes its mind the way a cat does. Janvier fell into step a pace behind. On the way they passed the florist on Rue de Hauteville. The buckets were out again, the chrysanthemums doing their honest work of looking like themselves. Duval's glance slid over them without interest, as if a smell from childhood had brushed him too quickly to be caught. No one spoke on the tram. It was crowded with the ordinary, Women with net bags, a man with a rolled newspaper, a child asleep against a sleeve that was not its mother's. Maigret watched Duval's hands. Well kept, the nails tidy, a pale line on the ring finger that had not yet learned it was no longer needed there. He wondered whether Duval would prefer the photograph with witnesses or without, whether he would press the seal with a thumb to feel the little resistance and tell himself that meant something. In the studio doorway, Vion's bell gave its small, obedient note. The photographer looked pleased to have his scene complete. He produced the envelope without preface, holding it by the edges the way priests hold certain objects so they can disclaim responsibility for them. Duval reached for it and paused, aware of the eyes. It was the pause he had been pursuing all along, the breath before the theatre begins. He looked at Maigret, as if to ask whether the inspector wished to play prompter or audience. Maigret only said, "Go on, it's only paper." The widower broke the seal with a careful thumb. The wax gave a soft crack that sounded larger than it was in the quiet room. He slid out the photograph and held it a fraction too far from his face, like a man who disowns what his eyes might do to him at close range. His mouth tightened, not with grief, not with tenderness, but with the old annoyance of being made to look where he hadn't chosen. He put the picture back in the envelope with professional efficiency and tucked it inside his jacket. "You misunderstand," he told no one in particular. "It is a private matter." "Of course," Maigret said. "Private matters are the most public thing we have." They left the studio with nothing dramatic accomplished. On the stairs, a woman going up smiled at Duval, because men in suits always look as if they are coming from something important. Outside, the afternoon held. The street had the innocent look of places that have hosted small cruelties and do not know it. At the corner, Maigret said, "You'll walk with me a few minutes." It wasn't a request. Duval set his hat a little lower on his brow, a gesture that would have been defiance if he had been made of sterner stuff. They went toward the park. The benches there had dried in patches shaped like old countries. A nurse wheeled a pram past, and the baby inside made a face at the light. Maigret stopped when the path turned, and the trees made a small room of shade. He looked at Duval without animosity. "You made a promise," he said. "You've been trying to keep it without letting it cost you anything." Duval's jaw worked. "You don't know what she asked." "No," Maigret said. "But I know what you've done with it. You've made it into a trick you can perform for yourself." Duval's hand went to the envelope in his breast pocket, then fell away. "You cannot possibly understand," he said, "which is what people say when they are afraid that you do." "Perhaps," Maigret conceded. "But I understand this. The woman you saw in that photograph is not the dead one. She is the living one you have been careful not to look at. If your promise has anything to do with kindness, begin there." He didn't wait for a reply. He walked away with Janvier, leaving Duval in the small rectangle of shade to decide which theatre he wanted to attend next. The light on the gravel made little needles that pricked the eyes. Somewhere behind them, the bell from a bicycle sounded twice and went on, polite and inexorable, like a reminder a city gives without taking sides. They left Duval in the shade because there was nothing left to say for the moment, and Maigret did not believe in hurrying the kind of man who lives by pauses. Back at the quay, the corridors had that Sunday afternoon hush that always made footsteps sound like they belonged to someone else. The woman was where he had asked her to wait, on the bench near the small window that looked into the courtyard, hands crossed on her lap, the dress no longer a costume so much as a fatigue she wore because there was nothing else. He told her only that Duval had taken the envelope. She didn't ask whether he had opened it there. She had the practicality of those who have learned that the choreography matters less than the decision it disguises. "He will come somewhere," Maigret said. "Not to the florist, somewhere with fewer witnesses." She nodded. "He likes doors," she said after a moment. "He likes to open them and stand there." "Does he like to close them?" "He likes to make other people close them." It wasn't said with bitterness, only with a small, flat knowledge. He led her to the little room again and left her there with coffee that went cool without either of them noticing. In his office, he sat and looked at the smoke that wasn't there yet until the impulse to light his pipe passed of its own accord. He thought of the earlier debt in Montreuil, the old report with Lachaume's name in it. Debts bred promises. Promises, when they went off, left a powder that got into everything. He asked Janvier to telephone the landlady on Rue des Petites Écuries, only to ask whether anyone had called for the key opposite the vacant room. The answer came back that there was no key to call for. The room across the hall had been kept closed, by wish of someone who paid for that wish. Who? Maigret asked when Janvier appeared in the doorway. She didn't want to say at first. Then she said it the way one lets go of something that has become a nuisance in the hand. Duval, since the wife died, so that it wouldn't be let to anyone who would make noise. Noise, Maigret repeated, and the word had a hollowness, like a room that has been empty long enough to forget its furniture. We'll go. He collected the woman with the same quiet he had used all day, and they crossed the river again, the pavements drying in patches like skin under the weak sun. Near the station, a man sold oranges from a crate and whistled a tune that never found its melody. In the stairwell of the boarding house, the air had its old smell of cabbage and old newspapers. Someone had polished the banister with something that didn't quite shine. Madame Caron met them halfway up the flight, breath not yet recovered from having run down and back as soon as she heard their feet. I was going to send a boy, she said, the apron already working between her hands. He's there. Which he? Maigret asked, though he didn't need the answer. Duval. 4th floor was too good for him today, I suppose. She breathed in and out with the small triumph of someone whose building has produced an event. He asked for the key. I told him we had none. He opened the door anyway. Men always have something that opens doors. Across the hall, the door that had not been a good room earlier stood ajar now, as if a mouth that had kept itself tight had forgotten and let a little sound escape. Maigret knocked with the courtesy he gave to empty rooms, then pushed it with 2 fingers. Duval was by the washstand, hat on the bed in a place the hat had chosen for itself, as hats do when they know they will not be there long. He had put the envelope on the table, and the photograph lay face down beside it, as if the picture were a person too, and had asked for a minute. On the chair was a small bundle wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, the way shopgirls tie, neat, snug, modest. He turned without surprise, because surprise is undignified, and Duval had spent too long practicing dignity in small rooms. Inspector. He shifted his weight and found nothing firmer than the floorboards, which were honest enough not to pretend. I wanted to put things in order. In a room you kept empty, Maigret said, neutrally. For quiet, Duval said. She had liked it quiet. He nodded toward the wall, as if the dead woman could be expected to lean between the plaster and the paper and admonish them all to keep their voices down. The woman had stopped at the threshold. The dress brushed the door jamb with a sigh. She looked first at the window, as if it might say what the room had felt like when she lived opposite. Then she looked at the bundle without moving toward it. What is it? Not much, Duval said. He untied the string with care, as if the room were watching him for clumsiness. Inside were 2 towels, almost new, a bar of soap still in its paper, a small tin of polish for shoes, and a key on a ribbon. For the door, he said, then added because he could not help it. It was always yours. He heard the lie as soon as it left his mouth and corrected it like a man correcting the placement of a plate at table. I mean, she would have liked that you had it. The woman did not take the ribbon. She looked at the tin instead, and Maigret saw something move in her face, the smallest of shifts, like the first crack that appears in ice, not because of weight, but because of temperature. She gave me one like that once, she said, almost to the air. When I first came, she said a person should polish one thing every day so the days don't become the same. Duval's fingers found the back of the chair. She said that to everyone, he replied, but there was no unkindness in it, only a man trying not to be impressed by an echo. He picked up the photograph and kept it face down in his hand, taking a breath that raised the coat a fraction, and then let it fall. "She asked me," he said, and the voice was different now, not the public voice he used for cards and cafes, but the voice people use for hospital corridors. "She asked me to be kind, to you, not to adopt you, not to confess anything in front of anyone. She knew me better than that. She said, 'Make it easy when you can. Don't make her stand outside doors.'" He glanced at the key as if it were guilty of something. I said yes. I meant it for the length of time it takes to say yes. The woman watched him without accusation. Sometimes that is what undoes people. He put the photograph on the table and at last turned it over. It was what it had to be. The wrong dress made to sit right, the veil pinned lower as if to hide the years that didn't belong to it. The bouquet turned to the light that tried to forgive everything it touched. The woman who had worn it looked like herself being asked to look like someone else. The eyes in the photograph had that particular reserve of those who have entered another person's room without being sure whether to take off their shoes. Duval looked at it and then away in the same movement, as if he had stepped into water that was not cold, but unwilling. "You paid for it," Maigret said, matter-of-factly. "I pay for things," Duval answered, and it had the sound of a confession, not because it was damning, but because it was exhausted. "It is what I know how to do." "You also kept this room empty." He nodded once. It seemed the simplest way not to have to decide every day. I told myself it was respect. He let the chair back go and put his hands on the envelope instead, flattening it to be sure it would not puff up and make him ridiculous. "I am not a cruel man," he said to no one in particular. "Only a man who keeps himself clean of certain messes so he can be comfortable in others." "You sent the note," Maigret said. "My hand did not," Duval said, and it was the closest he would come to agreeing. "I suggested to someone that a corner could be a useful place for seeing." "Viens," Maigret said. "Or la Chaume," Duval returned, and now there was a thin thread of irritation in him that sounded almost like grief in trousers. They both like to think they arrange other people's memories. One sells them, the other keeps them like old coins. Between them they set a stage. I only went along, like a man who takes the good chair at a wake because it is there. He looked at the woman again. I did not come down because I did not know which of them had made me a part of his decency. The woman took a step into the room then, and then another, as if checking whether the floor remembered her weight. She didn't touch the key. Her fingers twitched toward the photograph and stopped. When she spoke, it wasn't to Duval. It was to the space, to the old quiet. She told me once the quarrel would end, when there was nothing left for anyone to win. "That's a very Thérèse sentence," Duval said, and the name said aloud in the small room did something to him. He sat down on the bed without thinking to remove his hat from it first, and found himself with the hat now in his lap like an ungainly animal. She made me promise in the stupid way people make promises when they are already halfway into the next world and think words can be furniture placed after they've left. "And you," Maigret said, not unkindly, "preferred to purchase proofs." Duval made a movement with one hand that could have been a yes or the end of a shrug. "I wanted to be moved in the same place as before," he said softly, echoing Vion without knowing it. It seemed tidy. It was not a melodramatic collapse. It was the smaller, real sort. The shoulders that forget their trick of squaring. The jaw that stops holding the words at just the right angle. He put both hands on his hat as if to keep them from doing anything else, and for a strange, brief second looked more boy than widower. "Maître," the landlady hissed from the doorway. Habitual title slipped from some old story of another tenant. "There are people who want the room." It was her way of reminding them that the building had a life beyond their promises. "There will be," Maigret said, and she retreated, satisfied to have a line in a scene. The woman moved at last, She took the key, not the money. She slid the ribbon once between her fingers like thread. "I don't want to be kept," she said. "Not out, not in." Duval lifted his head. "Then I will stop keeping," he said, and it was as close as he could get to surrender. He placed the envelope on the washstand and stood, setting the hat properly on his head because decent men do not leave rooms bareheaded, even when they have failed. At the door he paused. He loved her, he said suddenly, as if offering this up might balance some scale. La Chaume, in whatever way men like him love, from too close to a wall. She made me promise because she knew he would make promises of his own and keep them until they bruised him. His promise? Maigret asked. To stand between you two without admitting he had chosen a side, Duval said. And the contempt in it was the safe sort that people allow each other when they are tired. Ask him what he was going to do with the photograph if I didn't pay. He had a plan for pity that involved an audience. When Duval had gone, the room felt larger, as rooms do, when a man who takes up space with his need to be understood leaves them. The woman stayed by the window and looked out at nothing that mattered. Maigret came to stand beside her with the indelicate bulk that had comforted more people than gentler men had. "You can go back to your office tomorrow," he said. "Or not. There's no rule about what comes after a promise is put away." She nodded. The ribbon of the key had left a faint pink mark on her fingers. "I'll find a place where the floorboards don't know me," she said. "It's easier that way." She looked at the photograph again, then turned it face down once more. "He wanted to be moved in the same place," she repeated, and almost smiled, tiredly. "People always think grief is a switch." On the stairs, Janvier touched Maigret's sleeve. "Do we see La Chaume now?" "We'll let him finish his night," Maigret said. "Men who keep themselves together with machines shouldn't be asked to fall apart before dark. Tomorrow will be clearer. Today has had enough theatre." They went down slowly. In the hall, a draft moved a scrap of paper along the floor, and the sound of it was exactly like a dresser's whisper. Outside, the florist had put the buckets out again with the obstinacy of commerce. Chrysanthemums held their shape in the thin sun. A boy chalked a goal on a wall and stepped back to admire it, the way boys admire boundaries before they learn about the ones they cannot draw. Back at the quay, Maigret let the woman sit in the little room as long as she liked. He went to his office and finally lit his pipe, the first pull of smoke sitting in his chest with the gravity of a decision made without being dramatic. He wrote nothing. There is nothing dumber than putting a day like this into a report before it has cooled. When he went back, the room was empty, coffee cups where he had left them, the chair pushed a little too carefully under the table. The dress lay folded across the back, a tired animal at rest. On the seat, not hidden, not displayed, the key on its ribbon. She had taken neither photograph nor envelope, nor the small bundle with the soap. She had taken only what couldn't be left on a chair. The decision sat there, simple as a clean plate. He stood in the doorway a long moment, listening to the building make its ordinary noises again, the footsteps, the doors, the cough 3 rooms away. Somewhere a clerk swore softly at a stubborn ribbon. He thought of the print shop's beat, the red of wax on cotton, the precise way a widower closes an envelope when he wants to believe that it is what keeps the contents from running out. Tomorrow there would be La Chaume and his careful shame, and perhaps Villon holding up his palms to show how little damage fancy does, if you call it by its proper name. Tonight there was the fact of a room no longer kept, a key that would belong to no one, and a city that, having hosted yet another private matter, was already making space for the next. He turned the photograph over once more, not to look at it, but to arrange the objects on the table so that no one would mistake what had happened for a case. Then he took his coat and stepped out. And Paris, which never stops raining entirely, even when the streets are dry, met him with the smell of stone and bread and the wet wool of strangers. Morning began in the soft, indifferent way it always did at the quay, when a case wasn't a case exactly, only a thread caught in the city's weave. The woman's chair was empty. The key on its ribbon lay where she had left it, patient and undecorated. The dress weighted across the back of the chair, the lace no longer trying to be anything but tired lace. Maigret stood looking at it a moment, and then, because there is a time for things to go back where they came from, he folded it carefully and carried it himself. The lending shop was not yet fully awake. Madame Raymond had one shutter half up and was sweeping the threshold with the dignified boredom of people who are never surprised by dust. When she saw the bundle, her eyebrows lifted a little, not in triumph, but in the relief of a ledger line that will now balance. It did no harm, Maigret said. He didn't apologize for the night. It never does, she replied, and then amended with a tradeswoman's honesty. Or if it does, it's not the dresser's fault. She took it from him, and, without comment, ran a hand along the seam where the faint dot of red still clung. He seals everything, that one, she said, meaning Villon without needing to say it, even what isn't his. On the way back, he stopped at Rue d'Hauteville. The florist had the buckets out early. He was on his knees with a rag, wiping the pavement where the water had stained it. He glanced up and nodded, the way men nod to others who keep their hours. He came again after you left, the florist said without prompting. Which he? The one who watches, stood across the street as if he had forgotten how to leave, stayed until the shutters went down. Did the other come? Number, he's a creature of afternoons, that one, the florist said, as if identifying a species. He dipped the rag, wrung it. Some people only know how to arrive late. At the Quai Janvier had located the end of the night shift on Rue Réaumur. They come out at 7:30, he said. The foreman sends them into the air like a bell lets out a sound. They waited in the little café that opened for workmen and policemen, the kind that had coffee strong enough to count as bread. The air smelled of steam and ink and warm glass. A little after the hour, the presses would have loosened their grip, and then the men came, one by one, in ones and twos, coats put on with the concentration of people who have been thinking only of one thing for many hours, and are now trying to think of themselves. Lachaume appeared in the second wave. He looked like he had learned his shape from the machines, narrow where they were narrow, fixed where they were fixed. When he saw the inspector, he stopped, and then, because stopping is theatrical, and he disliked that in himself, he came the rest of the way. Coffee? Maigret asked, as if asking whether he would like the weather improved. They took a table near the window. Outside, a wagon trundled past with paper strapped under a tarpaulin. The straps sang lightly against the boards. Inside, a woman behind the counter dried cups with the efficiency of a nurse. We saw Duval, Maigret said, once the coffee had arrived and cooled a little. Yes. The word came out like a card put down that can't take the trick. He has the photograph. I know, Lachaume said. He rubbed a thumb along the cup's handle. The ink on him made it look as if he were varnishing the porcelain. He would keep it even if it were of a stranger. He likes objects that admit to being pretty. You sent the note. I gave it to a boy to take to a tobacconist. He agreed, tired but not evasive. Boys are good for messages because no one remembers a boy's face. I wrote that he should be at the corner at 9. I wrote nothing else. And the dress? I said nothing about a dress, he said, not sharply, only with the calm of someone moving through a list he has made for himself many nights. I told Villon what we wanted in the picture, what he wanted, what I thought might move what he wanted into the right shape. Villon likes a mask. I hoped he would choose the right one. You hoped the wrong woman would make the right man behave, Maigret said. That is a lot to ask of lace. He accepted the reproach as if it were weather. I didn't want her near him in any other way, he said, and the admission was quiet enough that it scarcely disturbed the table. Thérèse was fond of her. That made me careful and clumsy at the same time. If I had brought her to him as herself, he would have found a place for her in his afternoons, the kind of place with the blinds half down. He shook his head as if at his own cowardice. So I thought, let it be the kind of kindness he understands. A picture in an envelope. He might open that. And you would have watched from a window, Maigret said. I did, he said. I was ready to come down if he came. I told myself that. It's a nice story to tell yourself while you are holding the curtain. Duval says you had a plan for pity that involved an audience, Maigret said. His tone was mild. It took the sting from the words. He looked at his hands. Only a poor man's plan. If he didn't pay, Villon would keep the negative. I thought of asking him to send a copy to the cafe where Duval plays cards, not to shame him. Shame doesn't work on people who use it for a living, but to make him choose. Men who like to be seen will do almost anything to control what is looked at. And did you? No, he said. I told it to myself until it felt like a thing that could be done. And then I did nothing. I have become good at that. The coffee had gone cold. Janvier nudged his, as if a different angle might warm it. Maigret watched the man across the table find his own edge of the admission he had been circling. She made me promise, he said, and the she needed no name in that moment. It was after the second fever. She said, be kind to her, not grandly, properly. She doesn't bear it well when people change the furniture in a room without asking. She meant, don't set her up in corners. Don't tell her she owes anyone anything. She was exact about such things. He lifted his eyes for the first time. And I chose a window. You paid for days to be kept empty, Maigret said. That was not nothing. I wanted there to be a place she could go if she needed a door that opened, he said. But it made me honest in the wrong way. Help at arm's length is a kind of indifference taught good manners. Duval paid, Maigret said, and there was no pleasure in telling him that. He received the correction, like a blow that doesn't change the body's shape, only the way breath moves through it. Of course, he said, he would. He likes tidy generosity. He drew the cup a centimetre and pushed it back again. I tell the truth badly. I loved Thérèse, in the way men like me love people who make smaller rooms feel like rooms at all, and I disliked him for being the sort of man who would always be allowed to arrive. And the woman? Maigret asked. Do you love her? He shook his head slowly. I like what she does to a room when she sits in it. I like that she does not ask. That is the same thing as love for men who live behind machines. It is also not the same thing. I didn't want to learn which. The cafe door opened. 2 workmen came in with the clean smell of wet stone on them. One of them laughed at nothing, the way men sometimes do after a long night when the body is relieved to be carried by daylight again. The sound touched the table and went on. If you wanted to keep the promise, Maigret said, there was a simpler way. You could have gone down the stairs and stood in the rain by her. You could have sent the boy to fetch a taxi and put her in it and told the driver any address that wasn't yours. You could have left the window. He accepted the inventory as a list he had written and misplaced. Yes, he said. I could have done any of those. I thought a picture would be easier. For everyone. He exhaled, a dry, small sound. It was easier only for me. He didn't weep. Men like Lachaume rarely do where it shows. Instead, the hand with the ink on it loosened on the cup. The shoulders that had learned the habit of avoiding door frames dropped half a notch. The muscle along the jaw that turns decisions into silence softened. It was the sort of collapse one only notices because the air near the person becomes less dense. What will you do with the negative? Maigret asked. I don't have it, he said. Villon keeps those as if they were coins. But he won't use it. He has his dignity too, which he polishes with words like art. You'll leave the window. I don't know yet. It wasn't defiance. It was a man telling the truth without drama. I am good at standing where the draft comes. They left him when there was nothing useful left to say. Outside, the street had that freshness particular to early hours in working quarters. The smell of yeast from a bakery, of damp wool, of yesterday's ink admitting to being yesterday's. A boy went by with a stack of posters under his arm, the top one telling the city about a concert that would be half over by the time anyone read it. At the quay, a note from Villon waited on Maigret's blotter. The man had sent it by hand, and the clerk who received it had described the messenger as one of those boys who become men without anyone noticing. It said only that Duval had paid and taken the photograph, and that there would be no second print unless the police required it, which was Villon's way of saying he knew where decency and commerce met. He telephoned the landlady on Rue des Petites Écuries. "The room?" he asked. "It's a room again," she said, which in her language was a small philosophy. "There's a girl from the glove factory who will take it Tuesday. Quiet one. They're all quiet the first week." He thought of the key on the ribbon, of the way the woman had left it, not like an accusation, but like a plate cleared from a table. He told the landlady to send the rent for yesterday, no one's, to the police charity box, and then hung up, because he had no taste for explaining why. Near noon, Madame Maigret sent a message through the desk sergeant that there would be stew if his day would tolerate it, and to please not forget that he had promised to bring bread. The prosaic kindness of bread sat next to the word promise in his head and did it good. He took his hat and went out, and on the way to the bakery dropped by Rue Richer. The cafe's blinds were half down. Duval sat in his usual place with the envelope beside his glass, not hidden, not displayed. He saw the inspector and looked not guilty, not pleased, only as if someone had set his shadow at the wrong angle. He didn't beckon. Maigret didn't go in. On the corner he stopped long enough to match his breathing to the traffic. Paris moved around him with its dry patience. A woman crossed with a loaf under her arm. A man folded a newspaper so the racing results would be on top when he reached his table. The city was already making room for the next private matter. Back at the quay, he found the small room empty again and was grateful for it. He put the woman's key in an envelope, not sealed, and wrote nothing on it. He placed the photograph on top of his filing cabinet, face down, not because he disliked looking at it, but because it deserved not to be on display. In the afternoon, he signed 2 reports that had nothing to do with promises and told Janvier to go home early and see whether there was light in his own windows that he hadn't noticed in days. Toward evening, when the grey began to collect again along the river, he walked to Rue d'Hauteville once more. The florist was closing. The last of the chrysanthemums went inside with a tired plastic sound. "You'll have rain again tomorrow," the man said, as if confiding a trade secret. "We always do," Maigret said. "We're in Paris." On the way back, the sky let down a few test drops that darkened the pavement in coins. He let them find his hat and shoulders, and he thought, not of what he had uncovered, which was modest, but of what had settled. A room no longer reserved for silence. A picture that would say less with each day. A man who might, if he stayed away from windows long enough, find a corner to sit in that belonged only to himself. A woman without a key who would not stand outside doors. He went home with the bread under his arm and, at the table, Madame Maigret told him a story about the grocer that had no bearing on anything and made the evening honest in a way nothing else could have. Later, when she had gone to set out cups for morning, he stood at the kitchen window and watched the rain begin again, gentle, stubborn, as if the city were practicing a habit it did not intend to break. Tomorrow, he would go once more to the print shop and then, perhaps, not need to go again. Tonight, there was a good chair and the taste of stew, and the thought of a promise reduced to its correct size, which is to say, something not grand, not theatrical, only a way of not making someone stand outside. Morning kept its promise of rain, a thin, well-bred drizzle that didn't trouble the pavements so much as remind them. The quay smelled of wet stone and old paper. Someone somewhere had opened a window too soon and then thought better of it. Maigret took the envelope with the unaddressed key from his drawer and set it in the middle of the blotter, as if to ask himself whether it was his business. Then he put on his coat and decided he would let the print shop's air tell him what to do before noon. Rue Réaumur had the same breath as yesterday, but gentler, presses ticking rather than thudding, as if the machines were easing themselves into conversation. The foreman frowned by reflex and waved him through. Lachaume was at his station, hat on its nail, sleeves rolled. He saw the inspector and finished whatever small adjustment he had begun, before stepping away with the careful economy of a man who has learned to leave no offence behind him in the oil on a gear. They stood near the doorway where the rain could be watched without being shared. Maigret didn't begin at the beginning. "You were at the studio last night," he said. "Yes." The answer came without decoration. "He sold it to me." "The negative." He nodded. "He called it property. I called it a debt. We met somewhere in the middle where men put banknotes when they don't want to say what they're buying." His hand went into his coat and came out with a small paper sleeve, the kind chemists use for remedies when the remedy is only talc. Inside was the strip of film, sleeping in its blackness. "I didn't want it any more than I wanted the window," he added, as if apologizing for having hands. "What will you do with it?" Maigret asked. "That is what I have not yet wanted to be. Write about." He held it as a man holds a small, warm creature that is neither friend nor enemy. The ink in the creases of his fingers made the gesture look like an illustration of a quiet sin. Maigret looked at the sleeve and understood that the decision would not profit by being witnessed in a police office. "Walk with me," he said. "I'm expected elsewhere to be told about art." Villon had opened earlier than his bell suggested. The studio held the clean damp of a room the night had forgotten to use. The stick of red wax on the desk was shorter by a joint. He smiled with the tired grace of a tradesman who slept with one eye open in case someone wanted to be reminded of themselves before breakfast. "You've come for a lecture," he said cheerfully. "I can do them short." "Do it this length," Maigret said. He touched the wax with a forefinger, and then the edge of the paper sleeve in Lachaume's hand. "You sold him the negative." "I transferred custody of an object I had made," Villon corrected, amiably. "Property moves toward people who want it most. He wanted it with his jaw. Duval wanted only to be seen holding his envelope. I serve both kinds." He shrugged in apology toward the profession. "A city like ours would be less itself if we were all moral." "You kept a copy," Janvier said from the window. "Not as accusation, but as one names a fact that would be true in any weather." "No," Villon said, surprising them with the exactness of it. "I made a proof and then destroyed it when he paid. I'm sentimental about certain disappearances. It makes me feel modern." He looked at Lachaume almost kindly. "You'll do nothing with it for a week, and then you won't know why you have it." "Perhaps I know now," the printer said quietly. "Perhaps knowing will be the only thing I do." Back on the pavement, the rain shook more coins out of the sky. They walked, without destination. At Rue de Hauteville, the florist was arranging a fan of leaves in a jar, as if reminding the chrysanthemums how to be statues again. He nodded to them with the mild dignity of a man who lives among faces that do not interrupt. "Give it to her," Maigret said at last. Not to the florist, who minded his vases, but to the man at his side. "Not to show, not to keep, to undo, if she wishes. Tell her it was never a test." "She will think it was," Lachaume said, "because I would have." "Then tell her anyway," Maigret said. "We have to lend people our better versions of ourselves sometimes. It's the only way they get used." They didn't find her. Of course they didn't. People who have returned keys learn to be where the key would never have fit. At the typing office on Rue de Faubourg Saint-Denis, the desk clerk said there was no woman of that description and there never had been. And Maigret thanked him for the courtesy of the lie. A tobacconist remembered a face that might have been hers if the light had been kinder. On a corner, a woman with a parcel under her arm recognized no one but loneliness and went on without looking up. They crossed to Rue Richer because there are habits you indulge even when they have no errand left in them. The café had its blinds at the same angle. Duval had the envelope in the same pocket. He won a hand with the small surprise of a man who treats luck like a waiter he knows by name. He looked up and saw them and did nothing. Sometimes that is exactly the thing a man does. At midday the inspector went home for stew because the day allowed it, and because Madame Maigret had taught him long ago that a promise can be kept with food as well as words. She set the pot on a trivet and told him about the grocer's niece who had fallen in love with a boy from a dairy and now believed that cows were romantic animals. He ate and let the story do what stories like that do, smooth the edge off the morning without taking anything from it. When she cleared the plates, she said, almost to herself, "People always think a hem can be let down again without showing. It always shows, but sometimes that's better. It proves the dress has had a life." He looked at her and felt the very gentle click of a thought coming to rest. "Yes," he said, "sometimes the mark is the point." He went back to the quay with a loaf under his arm, because bread keeps the day moral. In his office, a message waited on a slip of paper. A telephone call had come an hour earlier from a public booth near the canal. A woman's voice, unhurried, had said, would he please tell the gentleman with ink on his hands that there was no window. If he had something to give her, he could leave it in the box at the church of Saint Laurent, under the table where the candles had burned shorter than the parishioners wanted them to. She had hung up before the clerk could ask for a name and had not rung back to rescue him from his curiosity. There are instructions that move through a city without touching the police. This one allowed itself the courtesy of being written down. He read it and couldn't help the small bend at the corner of his mouth. Then he telephoned the print shop and left a message with the foreman that a gentleman's errand could be more fruitfully run at a church than at a window. The nave of Saint Laurent held the thin smell of wax and damp stone that belongs to places which rehearse faith between visitors. The box was where she had said. The table, pocked with small burns, looked honest about the length of consolation. Late afternoon filtered through a window so high up that it seemed designed for birds more than saints. Men in caps came to light candles and didn't. A woman pressed her forehead to the back of a pew and then to her own hands, as if negotiating with both. They didn't stand near the box. They sat 2 rows back, as if resting. When the light had become something that made the dust abroad in the air seem significant, the door opened and closed with a sound that the church understood better than the street, and he came in. He had no hat because men who work nights grow careless about day etiquette. He went to the box and hesitated, the way one does before posting a letter that has cost too much to write, and then he slid the paper sleeve inside and stood a moment longer, not praying, not absolving himself, only letting the act acquire weight. Then he went out with the precise gait of a man who has delivered a package and is suddenly stupidly lighter. They waited a little longer because dignity belongs to everyone, and also because the city likes to write its own stage directions. Then she came. Not in the dress, of course not. In a dark skirt that had learned its hem honestly, in shoes that belonged to pavements, and the small triumph of choosing which side of the street to walk. She went to the same box and took nothing out, because there was no way to do that without spectacle. She only slipped a hand under the table and felt for the shape that had not yet learned the church's smell. Whatever she decided to do with it, she did inside the sleeve, in a way that left the room exactly as it had been. When she stood again, the box was still a box, the table still recognizable to those who had knelt at it the day before, and the air had made room for the disappearance of a small thing, as if that were its job. She left without seeing them, because it is a kindness not to be witnessed choosing. Outside, the light had become the thin version of itself the city kept for certain hours. Janvier looked at Maigret as if to ask whether they ought to make a case out of a moment. The inspector shook his head. "If there was a crime," he said, "we've reduced it to size." They walked without speaking. The florist had brought in his buckets. The cordonnery opposite had its shutters half down, which is how some trades keep hope. On Rue Richer, the café was breaking into the evening version of itself. Duval came out alone and stopped at the door to do that theatrical thing of looking back at nothing in particular. He saw them, and this time he took off his hat. Not for them, for the gesture. But gestures have their own honesty when repeated often enough. He put the envelope, lighter now, or the same weight, it was hard to tell, into his pocket and went away down a street that would let him be the kind of man he could afford to be. At the quay, paperwork waited. It always does. Maigret signed the things that required his name, and left blank the line that did not. He put the unaddressed key in the drawer again, and then, impulsively, took it out and walked it to Madame Raymond's shop. He handed it to her without explanation. She took it without asking, and they both understood that it wasn't to open anything. Back home, the kitchen had kept a little of the noon smell. He cut the bread badly because he was thinking, and Madame Maigret corrected the angle with the machine grace of someone who manages the world by insisting that knives be held properly. They ate in a quiet that wasn't heavy. Later, he stood at the window and watched the rain begin again, slow and persuasive, putting back the city's polish one drop at a time. He thought of the hem that shows where it has been unpicked, and of the peculiar mercy of letting a thing wear its seams. He thought, too, of a photograph unmade in a church, and of a man with ink on his hands who would sleep badly for a week and then more or less well, and of a woman who had learned a new geometry of doors. Before he put out the light, he filled his pipe and did not light it, and for once the unlit pipe felt less like a habit than a small tribute to a day that had ended correctly. Not beautifully, not neatly, but in a way that did nothing grand, and therefore did no harm. Tomorrow there would be other promises to reduce to their proper size. Tonight, Paris had the sound of water on stone, and inside that sound there was room for everything that didn't need to be said. It was 2 days later when the city remembered how to be cold again. Not brutally, only with that clean edge that makes you draw your collar up without thinking. At the quay, the radiators clanked themselves into a temper. Somewhere down the corridor, a clerk fed a ribbon into a machine and swore softly, more to keep the morning company than because anything had gone wrong. On Maigret's desk, the drawer with the key no longer stuck. There was nothing in it worth resisting. The envelope he had walked to Madame Raymond's lay in his memory like a completed errand, square and unremarkable as a folded napkin. He had meant to go on to other things, and he did for an hour. Small thefts, a quarrel turned into a complaint because a neighbour had better words, the kind of day that makes a policeman feel like a man who keeps doors oiled. Still, the woman and her dress sat in the room with him, not in the way of a case that refuses to be solved, but like a chair someone has vacated carefully and that you do not yet wish anyone else to take. He went out to walk it off. The air in the streets had that faint iron taste it keeps for itself after rain. Near the bridge, the Seine had the colour of old pewter. A barge moved along it as if being told a story it had heard too often. At Rue d'Hauteville, the florist had set out violets for the first time that season, almost hidden behind the chrysanthemums, as if apologizing for being too early. The man caught Maigret looking at them and made a face to suggest that some people insist on spring, even when it can't hear them. Across the way, the cordonnerie had its shutter up 3/4, which was how it preferred to be, committed but prudent. The window above it stayed shut. Curtains, honest now. If there was a figure behind them, it was the sort that lives there by deed rather than habit. A coat hung, a chair pulled slightly crooked, the shadow of a plant that would not thrive. He stood long enough to feel foolish and then chose not to. On Rue Réaumur, he stepped into the print shop without thinking he was doing so. The foreman's nod had already grown familiar enough to count as greeting. Near the back, Lachaume fed the machine its paper and took it back again, the way people feed children who are not hungry and will not say so. The printer saw him and came as far as the doorway, leaving his sleeves rolled and his hands the colour of his trade. "She took it," he said before Maigret could ask. "Or didn't. The only thing that matters is that I no longer have it." "Good," Maigret said. "I had imagined telling her what to do with it," he went on, and there was a flicker of a smile the machine could not rub out. "She spared me by not asking." "People do that," Maigret said. "The better ones, at any rate." He asked him nothing more because there was nothing more needed. They stood there a minute, not listening to the presses. Then, because the day wanted tasks, they nodded and parted. At Parc Monceau, the light happened to fall more kindly than it had any right to. Villon was outside his studio with a broom, using it not to sweep so much as to prop up the afternoon. He looked almost sheepish when he saw the inspector, like a man found in the decent act of folding laundry. "You'll be relieved to know," he said, "that I am working on babies this week. They quarrel about nothing and forgive too easily. It corrects my mood." "You sold a thing that didn't want to be owned," Maigret said. "I sold a tendency," Villon corrected with shameless good humor. "It never stays sold." He looked toward the park, as if a customer might be walking his way, and then back at Maigret with something that might have been candor. "It isn't always the picture they want. Sometimes it's the moment they can point at and say, 'There, that was when I should have felt it.'" "And did they?" Maigret asked. "Almost," Villon said, "which is worse and better." He left it there. A policeman can spend his days arguing with tradesmen about the exact border between commerce and feeling, but there is no arrest at the end of it, only fatigue. He turned toward Rue Richer because habits will have their way. The café was thinner than usual, a lull between those who needed a table to exist and those who were preparing to perform. Duval stood at the counter with his hat not quite square, talking to the waiter in the tone men use when they explain something harmless to prove they are harmless. The envelope was no longer on the table beside him. It had done its work of being seen. Whether the photograph was still inside, it was the sort of question only vanity needed answered. He looked up and saw Maigret. For a moment, his face produced the beginning of one expression, and then, finding the theatre empty, let it dissolve. He lifted his glass the way one lifts a veil from a plate to show there is nothing threatening beneath it. The inspector did not go in. Afternoon drew itself out. On the edge of evening he crossed the courtyard at the quay and found Janvier sitting on the low wall under the plane tree, smoking the way young men do who are thinking about nothing to give their thoughts room to find them. He stood when the inspector approached, out of habit rather than necessity. "She telephoned again," Janvier said. "Not to the office, to the photographer. He told the clerk because he enjoys being the post in a fence. She wanted him to know that there would be no copy. He said he had already decided as much when he sold the negative, but he was pleased to have his virtue confirmed." "And Duval?" Maigret asked. "Asked if there were any charges. I told him we collect those mostly in cafes." They let that be sufficient. Work returned them to itself for a while. The building had its appetite for signatures and initials. He satisfied it. Towards 7, he took his coat and thought of the bread on his way home and the little remark he might make at table to earn himself the look from his wife that told him he had remembered he lived there too. On Rue du Faubourg Saint-Denis, under a weak lamp, he saw her. Not because she called to him, she didn't, but because some part of him had been leaving space in the street for her to fit back in. She had no dress now, only her skirt and the coat that had paid for itself twice over in rain. In her hand, she carried a small bunch of violets, wrapped so tightly that they looked like an intention. She was reading a slip of paper as she walked, an address, he thought, or the list of a place's rules, and then folded it and put it in her pocket, as if accepting them. When she reached the corner, she paused and looked at the crossing, not as a thing to be overcome, but as a choice a person can make with dignity. She saw him then and gave the sort of nod one gives a man who has not made anything worse. He raised his hat, which is the right reply. "Will you be all right?" he asked, because the question insisted. "Yes," she said. Then, after the smallest shift that made the word less polite and more true, "Enough." He would have liked to give her a sentence worth keeping, but the ones he knew were all furniture moved around other people's rooms. He settled for what a man of his kind can offer without insulting anyone. If there is ever a door that refuses you, tell it you know me. Some doors are less rude when they hear my name. She smiled at that, in the way people smile when something practical also carries a little tenderness they do not wish to encourage. "I know doors," she said. "I'll choose ones that open from the inside." He watched her go until the lamp stopped owning her, then turned toward the river with that lightness a day gets when it has ended correctly without bragging. The quay took him back. The office smelled of tobacco and damp wool. The window had formed its evening silhouette of his hat and shoulders, as if to reassure the building that it had not been left alone. He sat a minute because he preferred to arrive home with his thoughts folded. He thought of the promise given in a room where water had been boiled too long, of a widower who had tried to prove to himself that grief could be made to stand exactly where it had stood before, of a man with ink on his hands who had learned the difference between waiting and standing beside, of a photographer who sold approximations to people who needed them and who, this once, had shown a little decency in the arithmetic of disappearance. He thought of a dress whose seams bore the history of hands, and of a hem that showed it had been let down and was better for it. There was no report to write that would not sound foolish on paper. No one had struck anyone, or taken anything that could be named, or been struck down by anything more chargeable than pride. The small notes he had made, names, times, a boy's habit of carrying messages without asking what they carried, went into a file whose number would end up belonging to another matter. He tamped his pipe and didn't light it. The smell of unlit tobacco is a promise without drama. He preferred it. On the way past the desk, the sergeant glanced up. "Anything further, Chief?" "Only that we should keep an eye on the weather," Maigret said, which in that building passed for philosophy. He walked home with bread under his arm. Madame Maigret met him with a look that took his measure and found it acceptable for the evening. Over the soup, he told her that the grocer's niece had chosen a dairy boy. She told him that the laundry had mislaid an apron and then discovered it where it was meant to be. He said nothing about photographs. She said nothing about wax. After supper, he stood at the kitchen window, and Paris gave him the rain it had been thinking about all day. Soft, convinced, doing its old task of laying the city flat enough for everyone to rest on it. A bus went over the bridge and brought a brief brightness into the wet. Somewhere, a church box held nothing important, and therefore something very proper. Somewhere a room that had been kept empty longer than it deserved was practicing the voices of the people who would sleep in it. Somewhere a man laid down a card and accepted that it would not, this time, make anyone look at him. Before bed, he took from his pocket a scrap he had kept without knowing he had. A piece of ribbon, the colour of cooked cherries, no longer attached to any key. He put it in the drawer with the other harmless things that make a life feel recorded. Old matches, a button, a pencil too short to pretend to be useful. He closed the drawer and the house clicked softly around him. He didn't say out loud that the case was over because it had never exactly begun. He only let the truth settle in the way good rain does, that sometimes a policeman's work is to stand as long as needed until people remember which door they were meant to use and then step aside so they can go through it. In the bedroom, he set down his hat and loosened his tie as if unfastening a day. The city pressed its damp cheek to the windows and did not ask to be let in. He put out the light and lay listening to the familiar weight of silence, which, when you allow it, says everything that needs saying.